So tonight I want to begin to use the Metta Sutta as the framework of my talks. So I will be referring to both the Pali and the English, and we've spent much of the last 24 hours, fits and starts, putting together a translation into Italian from various sources and from my own kind of So you each should have a copy of the Italian translation, so you know you can read for yourself. So one thing to say at the outset, Pali is a language that is quite condensed. A lot of the meaning is embedded in the grammar. And so, of course, it is open to interpretation. So I use a translation into English that I like, and I modify it a little bit when I look at the Pali and go, this has been going on for 2,500 years. So just to know this is very useful. You know, I don't know if in Italy you played this game, but if you put a bunch of children in a circle and you whisper something into the first child's ear and it goes around, by the time it gets to the end, it's not the same thing. So going back to the Pali is really important, because these are texts that have been first memorized and then written down. And yes, we can all interpret them a little differently, but at least the Pali is there. So I will be referring back from time to time to some aspects of the Pali. And a lot of the going back and forth to the Pali has ended up into the Italian translation. And this goes back to interpretation. I'm sure giving this translation to 3 different people, you'd have a good hour of discussion. It's like, no, it should be this way. No, it should be that way. So all of this said as a qualifier to don't believe what I say, believe your own experience. This is what the Buddha said all the time. Practice and see for yourself. That in this tradition is the gold standard, not some text. But the texts are really valuable because they give us a framework and they give us an idea of what the Buddha was teaching that then we can use for inspiration and for information. And I'm continually amazed how much I find in this very short sutta. So we'll start at the top. Karaniyam Atakusalena Yantang Sangtam Padam Abhisamecha. Those first lines in Pali. So already, in the very first line, there's room for interpretation. Because that grammar leaves it open to 2 different basic meanings of that first line. So karaniyam is basically, it's the gerund of karoti, to do, to make. And so it gives already this meaning. It's a much stronger meaning than just to do. But what exactly that is, there are 2 possibilities. So it could describe conditions necessary for practice, or it could describe the manifestation of somebody who has already practiced, what their behavior looks like. And if you look at the English Metta Sutta chant, you'll see that there's a really different translation of this first line. This translation that I have with the Pali chant, this is what's done by one skilled in what's good. That's the manifestation thing. This is, if somebody is skilled in what's good, this is what it looks like. Whereas the Amaravati English chant that a lot of you are familiar with starts with, this is what should be done by one who is skilled in what's good. That's a very different meaning. I land more with, this is what's done by one who is skilled. Not because of grammar, but just because there's less pressure. This is what I should do. And then, we look at that and go, oh, I'm not that. And then we doubt our own capacity. We read the next 2 verses and go, oh, I don't think so. I can't do that. Or, I don't even want to do that. But when it is a simple description, that's much more empowering. So this is what's done by one who's skilled in what's good, who reaches towards that most peaceful state. In other words, if we want peace, this is what we can cultivate. And actually, it's not necessarily a duality. It's not necessarily either or. I think it's actually probably both. So this is what it looks like for somebody who's skilled. And then if you want to follow in their footsteps, that's what needs to happen. Either way, they're right at the beginning. And the Buddha didn't speak randomly. He put these paragraphs at the beginning because they are the foundation of the practice. They're really important. And please remember who the Buddha was addressing here. He was offering this sutta to this group of monks who had come back to ask him if they could practice in a different place than they were. In a different place. They were practicing in a place that they didn't think was suitable, and they wanted to move. They were really sincere, dedicated monks. And they knew the suttas, but they hadn't practiced much. They knew the teachings, but they hadn't practiced. And they'd gone to this place and were promptly haunted by spirits. And after a couple of weeks of this, they finally realized, no, we have to leave. This is just, we're all being haunted by different spirits. And this was the middle of the rains retreat, where monks are supposed to stay in one place. So for them to go back to the Buddha, which was a long journey, and to say, please let us practice somewhere else, was a drastic move for them. And as a monastic, I chuckle when I think of this story because we've all had the experience of going to the Sayadaw and asking a difficult question and getting a difficult answer back. So what the Buddha said to these monks is he cast his celestial eye over the whole of the universe, and he saw that the place where they'd been, where all those haunting spirits were, was the one place where they could practice successfully. And so I can well imagine him looking at them going, what are you guys doing here? And then, the monks going, Venerable Sir, we're so scared we can't practice there. Please let us go somewhere else. And what he said to them after he realized, well, that's the place. He said, sorry, back you go. And then he gave them this, saying at the end of it, this is your protection and this is your practice. So those very first lines, this is what is to be done by one who's skilled in what's good and who reaches towards the highest state, is a description of those monks. That second word, Akusala, there's a meaning that Ajahn Sujato gives it, which I think really illuminates the whole sutta. He opens that meaning out, not just skilled in what's good, but also who, and he takes this meaning from a couple of other texts. One who knows the texts is the meaning of that. Skilled in what's good means one who understands the texts and has learned them. So the meaning is one who knows the texts, has understood them intellectually, and who wants to practice. So that's saying, okay, you guys, you know this, you want to practice, and this is what you need to do. Also, skilled in what's good, Akusala, was mentioned in the commentaries as somebody who understands right effort. And I'll cycle back to that piece later, so just put a pin in that. And so this is what's done by one skilled in what's good, who reaches towards that most peaceful state. What does he mean by peaceful state? That most peaceful state, people mostly assume it means nibbana, but there are lots of other possible interpretations. And I think it's really useful to see that phrase, peaceful state, as meaning a continuum, as from just a general inner psychological peace, all the way to nibbana, the transcendent peace, including the calm abiding of concentration. So that whole continuum from transient peace for a second to permanent peace of nibbana. And really reflecting about this is very inspiring in the practice for me personally. So I wanted to share a few reflections about this, because if we just consider like the jhanas and nibbana, it just feels so big and unattainable. But have any of you today experienced a couple of seconds of peace, or even a few minutes of peace? We reach for this peaceful state, and it's right here, right now, available to all of us. And so, not only have we experienced this peace, but each of us probably knows what happened before that to cause that peace to arise. Somebody mentioned how the first day was such a struggle. Fatigue, restlessness, pain in the body, really resisting all of that and resisting the practice. And then there was a moment of just complete surrender. This is the way it is. And suddenly it became peaceful, calm, much easier. Reaching for that peaceful state, practicing in order to access peace, can happen in any moment. Or I should say, the success at accessing peace can happen at any moment. This peaceful state is not unattainable. It's direct, immediate experience, here and now, available to each of us. So it's really important in the practice to notice those small moments of peace and really pay attention. It's like, oh, this is available, first of all. Understanding it. Oh, this mind and body, there is access to peace. It is possible. Acknowledge the peace and give it the space to be there. Acknowledge in that very moment there is peace, there is joy, there is lightness, whatever it happens to be. Because unless you are an arahant or a Buddha, it will change, sadly. But that's the truth of the way things are. And when it changes into something that is not peace, we tend to pay more attention to that. We dismiss the experience of peace as just a few minutes or a few seconds, and we obsess about the lack of peace and to the quite human and predictable reactions to that change. So there's peace, and then it changes to restlessness, maybe, and we're disappointed or irritated. And we try very hard to change it back to that state of peace. And the more we resist it, the more restless we get. We get frustrated, we get doubtful, and we wonder why we're here. We're all familiar with these tornadoes. And that comes from the mind latching on to the unwholesome mind state as eternal. But it's not. It's no more eternal than the peace. And all that resistance is just making it worse. If in that moment of change and dropping into restlessness, we don't forget that access is possible. If we remember that access to peace is possible, that can stop all of that in one moment. So what that looks like is, oh, restlessness has arisen. Oh, it's so unpleasant. Acknowledging the restlessness, acknowledging the unpleasantness, and then we can very briefly take a moment to remember, yeah, but I know I can access peace, so if I just keep going, this will change too. May I be at ease with this anyway, inclining to metta. And then we just keep going with the practice. Without drama, without frustration, without disappointment. I'm sure you've all had the experience of a bird flying into a room through an open window. And poor little things that get so desperate to get out, and the window's still open. But they're over there, for some reason, they don't turn around and go back the way they came. So there they are. They're caught when they could just escape, but they're totally caught. Just like we get caught in these negative mind states. So that acknowledgement and that holding of that experience and inclination to metta is like the bird turning around and making its way back to the window and leaving, rather than bashing itself against the window on the opposite side of the room. So, knowing we can access peace really changes the practice. Please don't forget that. And then the next thing I want to pull out of these two lines is that word is skilled. So skilled in what's good, what's wholesome, what's beneficial. So that word kusalena, you may also know the word kusala, wholesome. It's the same root. So here's one basic aspect of right view. Right view is a factor of the Eightfold Path. Part of that skill is knowing what's wholesome and knowing what's unwholesome, knowing the difference between wholesome and unwholesome. That's a big part of what is being skilled in what's good. Because peace doesn't fall into our laps. It happens because we know it's kusala, we know it's good, and we keep inclining in that direction. So being skillful in what is good is basically skillful in access to wholesome states. And skill is a wonderful word here, because skill can be cultivated, it can be developed, it can be polished and perfected. And there's so many metaphors for this. I don't know if you personally, or maybe your children, or somebody in your family, you give a 10-year-old child a violin, or a 5-year-old child a violin, and say, okay, this is how you make sound, and then put your earplugs on because it sounds awful. But if that child practices diligently over time, they can become a concert violinist. Same with the practice. It might look awful at first, but that's okay. We have to begin somewhere. We have an expression in English, practice makes perfect. And I really like this because, well, we practice meditation. We don't practice perfection. I'm going to practice now, is what we say. We don't say, oh, I'm going to perfect now. It just doesn't sound, it doesn't make any sense. Except somehow it's so easy to twist our view of practice and get disappointed when it isn't perfect. And we get so disappointed and distressed when it isn't perfect. But how is it supposed to be perfect? It can't be. It really can't be perfect. Because we're human beings. This sounds really silly when I say it, but I'm sure everybody has had that experience of disappointment in, oh, the practice isn't going very well, I can't do it right. That's comparing what's happening right now in this moment with something in our mind, some idea of how the practice should be. So, in those moments, simply remembering wholesome, unwholesome. Metta is wholesome. Irritation, disappointment, confusion is not wholesome. And so that understanding of wholesome from unwholesome is really essential in those moments when we get lost in the delusion of ideas, or when we get lost in, maybe we have had a moment of peace and we reach for it in an unwholesome way. Get lost in greed, or in any kind of dosa reaction about the practice. So in that cultivation and purification, that training and purification I spoke about, this is actually quite central, this aspect of knowing wholesome from unwholesome. And knowing that, knowing what to feed and what to refrain from. And this is another path factor, basically, right effort. And there's nothing more important in the practice than balanced effort. At least if you use as an indication the number of times the Buddha mentioned right effort. And we make the mistake of thinking right effort is about the amount of effort we use. But it's not. It's about how we use our effort, how we use our energy. And I think the commentary that said skilled in what's good means understanding right effort is right on the... They really nailed it. And this is a whole talk in itself, and I don't want to go there, but just to mention what it is and to remind you of what it is. Right effort is simply feeding the wholesome and starving or refraining from the unwholesome. So it's that moment of, okay, this has arisen, now what? Do I feed this mind state or do I refrain from it? If it's unwholesome, we acknowledge it, go to metta instead. So this is why mindfulness is so important in the practice. Not just the vipassana practice, but the metta practice. It's what's giving us, it's in the background, but it's what gives us that ability to say, oh, restlessness. Pause. Now what? So that skill in what's good that is right effort means acknowledgement and surrender to what is happening right now and not following what is unwholesome, refraining from it, and supporting and maintaining the wholesome. So inclining to metta again and again and again, but in a balanced way from that place of choice. It's not force. It's, oh, I know where that goes, and I don't want to go there. I'm going here instead. That's not force at all. This takes effort. Of course it does. Because we're fighting all those bad habits that are, have been conditioned in our mind stream. But skill in what's good is really a wholehearted engagement in this process. And following a gentle discipline. So not letting the mind wander where it wants, not following habits of instant gratification, but really training the mind over and over and over again, gently, to incline to what's wholesome, even if in the moment it doesn't feel pleasant. That balance is such a beautiful thing. But there are no recipes for how to attain it. The very best way to learn balance is to fall over and over and over again, and get up over and over and over again. We learn a lot by making mistakes. Somebody reported something very sweet today. It was really a very interesting experience. We, of course, have been, introduced this morning, the dear friend, and this person got very excited. Oh boy. And I'm going to radiate metta for my brother. It's just, I can't wait. So much enthusiasm to dive into the practice. And unseen in that enthusiasm was this, that greed. Not being mindful of the unwholesomeness of the greed. Of course, then what happened was she hit a wall. And it's happened to all of us at some point. It's like, I can't, it's just like, so much enthusiasm. And then the heart, just closes. We have this moment of, oh boy, I'm really going to go for it. And when we fall into the difficulty that follows, we learn so much when we stop and we realize, oh, wait a minute. That was greed. And knowing the difference between when greed is present and when greed is absent, that's a huge piece of information. Knowing in the practice, it's like that kind of excited effort. It's like once we experience that once, we don't forget it. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, I know where this goes. So don't worry about falling down. Don't worry about making mistakes. You can get a lot out of that. And don't worry about how there's no recipe for how to do it right. Just notice the difference between right and wrong. Not ethically right and wrong, but wholesome, unwholesome, skillful, unskillful. I don't want to go there. I'll go there instead. Noticing in the mind, greed, aversion, delusion, and what happens when we follow those. Really notice that. And non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion. What happens when we feed those? That's how we become more and more and more skilled in what's good. So I've made it through 2 lines of the sutta. I studied a little bit with Bhikkhu Bodhi in Sri Lanka, and I was amazed. This was decades ago. I was so amazed that the first 3 hours of, the first time I went there, we spent 3 hours on 2 lines in the first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, and I thought, how does he do that? The more you look at the Buddha's teachings, the more they blossom and you see the depths. It's just remarkable how much is in here. I want to close with a quote from a dear friend of mine, Narayan Liebenson Grady, who's a wonderful Vipassana and Metta teacher in the United States. She says this: the practice of metta is not an effort to convince ourselves of anything. It's not an effort to demand, plead, or pretend. It's tapping into what we really are, which is love itself. So, by perfecting this skill and right effort, may we really see clearly this beautiful quality of metta that is a natural quality of the pure mind. Thank you for your kind attention, and let's just sit, let the words settle.